The millionaire CEO laughed at the cleaning lady's business plan until she saved his $2 billion deal. Before we begin this story, tell us in the comments, what is the biggest dream you have right now? And at the end of the story, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy. The laugh wasn't just a sound, it was a weapon. Cold, arrogant, and sharp, it cut through the tense silence of the 80th floor boardroom, echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the glittering expanse of Manhattan. Carter Sterlingworth, CEO of Sterlingworth Global, didn't even look at the woman standing before him. His eyes were fixed on the crumpled napkin on the polished mahogany table. On it, a crudely drawn but surprisingly detailed sketch of a small building was accompanied by handwritten notes. "A community-focused eco-cafe," he read aloud, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He finally glanced up, not at her face, but at her uniform, the simple gray attire of the night shift cleaning crew. "And you think this," he flicked the napkin with his finger, "is a viable business plan?" Brooklyn Cooper felt the heat of a dozen pairs of eyes on her. The architects, the executives, the investors, all of them were watching, some with pity, others with the same smug derision as their boss. She felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she refused to let her voice tremble. "I believe it is, sir," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "It's based on sustainable architecture and community engagement, two of the fastest-growing sectors in urban development." Another chuckle escaped Carter, this one shared by a few of his subordinates. "Sustainable architecture? My dear, you clean toilets for a living. What could you possibly know about development sectors?" The dismissal was brutal and absolute. Brooklyn felt a familiar sting behind her eyes, the same one she'd felt 1,000 times in her life when people looked at her and saw only her uniform, not the person inside it. But she wouldn't cry. Not here. She simply nodded, her dignity her only shield. "I'm sorry to have wasted your time, Mr. Sterlingworth." She reached for the napkin, her napkin, the one she had spent months refining in her head, the dream she had finally found the courage to sketch out. But Carter placed his hand over it, pinning it to the table. "Leave it," he said dismissively. "It'll give us something to laugh about when this disastrous meeting is finally over." That was it. The final cut. Brooklyn simply turned and walked towards the door, the sound of her own steady footsteps the only thing she could hear over the pounding in her ears. She kept her back straight, her head held high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "All right, back to the real world," Carter announced, his tone shifting back to business. "The Azure Bay project. We are 2 weeks from the deadline, and the architects are still telling me the central pavilion design is structurally impossible on that terrain. $2 billion are on the line, gentlemen, and all I'm hearing are excuses." An older architect, a man with a prestigious reputation, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Sterlingworth, as we've explained, the coastal erosion on that specific cliffside makes a cantilevered structure of that size too risky. The weight distribution is—" Brooklyn paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She hadn't meant to listen, but the words Azure Bay and cantilevered structure caught her attention. She had seen the initial project blueprints weeks ago, left behind on a table she was cleaning. She had been fascinated by the ambition of it, a luxury eco-resort on a challenging coastline. The stress on the load-bearing points would be immense, the architect was saying. We'd need to sink pylons 30 meters deep, which would destroy the very ecosystem the resort is meant to celebrate. Without thinking, without even meaning to, Brooklyn spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it sliced through the room's tense energy. "The problem isn't the structure," she said, not turning around. "It's the anchor." The entire room went silent. Carter slowly turned in his chair to look at her, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Excuse me?" Brooklyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She should just leave, walk out, and never look back. But the architect inside her, the student who had won scholarships before life forced her to drop out, couldn't stay silent in the face of a flawed design. She turned around, her eyes no longer filled with humiliation, but with a focused, intellectual fire. "You're trying to fight the cliff," she said, walking slowly back towards the table. "You should be working with it." The architects exchanged baffled, almost insulted looks. "And who are you to lecture us on engineering, young lady?" one of them scoffed. Brooklyn ignored him, her gaze fixed on the blueprints spread across the table. "You want a cantilevered pavilion that feels like it's floating over the ocean, but you're anchoring it on the unstable part of the cliff. The weight needs to be distributed inland." She picked up a pen from the table, and her hand, the same one that pushed a cleaning cart every night, began to sketch on a blank notepad with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. "You don't use deep pylons. You use a counterweight system, like a sail. You anchor the main support beams deep into the bedrock, 100 meters inland. The pavilion itself becomes the smaller part of a much larger lever." She drew a simple, elegant diagram. "The structure doesn't just hang off the cliff, it balances on it. It uses the stability of the land to create the illusion of floating over the sea." She looked at the head architect. "You reduce the environmental impact to almost zero. You solve the weight distribution problem, and you can build the pavilion exactly as designed." The room was utterly, completely silent. The team of high-paid architects stared at her simple sketch, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. It was so simple, so elegant, so obvious, once it was pointed out. Carter Sterlingworth stood up and walked slowly around the table until he was standing in front of her. He looked from the sketch to the blueprints, then to her. He didn't look amused anymore. He looked stunned. "How?" was the only word he managed to say. "How did you know that?" Brooklyn finally remembered who she was, the cleaning lady who had just overstepped every imaginable boundary. She put the pen down, her confidence faltering. I studied architectural design," she said quietly, before I had to stop." Carter continued to stare at her, his mind clearly racing, connecting the dots between the drawing on the napkin and the brilliant engineering solution she had just provided. The woman he had dismissed, the one he had humiliated, had just saved his $2 billion deal in under 2 minutes. He looked at his team of experts, who were now murmuring excitedly amongst themselves, already seeing how her idea would work. Then he looked back at Brooklyn. "Don't go anywhere," he said, his voice a low command. He turned to his stunned executives. "Meeting adjourned, everyone out, except for you," he said, his eyes locking onto Brooklyn's. Within a minute the boardroom was empty. It was just the two of them, standing in the silent, cavernous space. Carter walked over to the napkin, the one he had mocked just minutes before, and picked it up, studying it with a new, intense focus. This isn't just a cafe, is it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "No," she said, her courage slowly returning. "It's a prototype for a new kind of urban space. Self-sustaining, zero waste, built with recycled materials, with a rooftop garden that provides produce for the kitchen and the local community." He looked from the napkin to her, a look of sheer disbelief on his face. He had seen hundreds of business plans, sat through thousands of pitches from the brightest minds from Harvard and Stanford. None of them had the simple, profound elegance of the idea sketched on a throwaway piece of paper by a cleaning lady. "I need you to work for me," he said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. Brooklyn let out a short, humorless laugh. "As what, your in-house janitor and engineering consultant?" The sarcasm in her voice was sharp, and he knew he deserved it. "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. He walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. "I want you to build this," he said, holding up the napkin. "Your eco-cafe. I'll fund the entire project. You'll have your own team, your own budget. Whatever you need." Brooklyn stared at him, her mind reeling. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, handed to her by the very man who had just trampled on that same dream. "Why?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Carter looked at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes beyond arrogance and power. It was a flicker of genuine, raw admiration. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I have a feeling you're the most brilliant person in this entire building, and I was too blind and too arrogant to see it." He took a step closer. "So, Miss Cooper, do we have a deal?" Brooklyn stared at the man in front of her, her mind struggling to catch up with the whiplash of the last 10 minutes. One moment, she was being publicly humiliated. The next, she was being offered her wildest dream on a silver platter by the very man who had just mocked it. "A deal?" she repeated, her voice laced with the suspicion he so richly deserved. Mr. Sterlingworth, 5 minutes ago my business plan was a joke you were going to laugh about later. Now you want to fund it? Carter had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, regaining his usual CEO composure. I was mistaken. Your subsequent demonstration of expertise has convinced me that your ideas may have merit. May have merit, she echoed, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. You mean after I saved your $2 billion project that your team of geniuses couldn't figure out? That kind of merit? He clenched his jaw. He was not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone who until recently he hadn't even known existed. Yes, that kind of merit. Now about my offer. Let's get a few things straight first, Brooklyn interrupted, crossing her arms. The fear and humiliation were gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. If he wanted to enter her world, he would do it on her terms. First, this is not your project. It's mine. You are the investor, the silent partner. You provide the funds, I provide the vision and the execution. My name is on the door. My principles guide the construction. Carter opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He was intrigued. In his world, people fought for credit, for power. She was fighting for control over her own dream. Go on, he said, his eyes narrowed. Second, no corporate nonsense. We don't have endless meetings about synergy or mission statements. We build something real, something that serves the community. We use local suppliers, we hire from the neighborhood, and we build it sustainably, even if it's not the cheapest way. That's not how you maximize profit, he countered, the businessman in him taking over. I'm not trying to maximize profit, she shot back. I'm trying to build a business with a soul. If that's a problem for you, then this conversation is over. They stood in a standoff, two completely different worlds colliding. He saw spreadsheets and bottom lines. She saw people and purpose. For a long moment, Carter just studied her. This woman who had nothing was willing to walk away from a blank check to protect her principles. It was the most insane and the most impressive thing he had seen in his entire career. Fine, he said at last. Your vision, your rules. Third, she continued, not letting up. I'm not your employee, I'm your partner. That means you don't get to order me around. And you don't get to show up in your $1,000 suits and treat the construction site like your personal country club. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You have a problem with my suits? I have a problem with what they represent, she said honestly. They represent a world that looks down on people like me, a world that laughs at ideas on a napkin. The hit landed, and they both knew it. All right, Miss Cooper, he said, extending a hand. A partnership. On your terms. She looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes. She still didn't trust him, not completely, but she trusted her dream, and he was, for better or worse, the only path to it. She shook his hand, her grip firm and decisive. Deal. The next week was a blur. Brooklyn, true to her word, took charge. She spent her days scouting locations and her nights refining her business plan, adding details about supply chains, community outreach programs, and architectural specifics. Carter, true to his word, provided the resources. He assigned a small team from his company, a lawyer and an accountant, to handle the financial framework, but he stayed out of the creative process. He tried, of course. He'd send her emails with links to high-tech, minimalist cafe designs from Tokyo and Copenhagen. She'd reply with a single line. Too cold, needs more heart. He'd suggest prime real estate locations in Midtown with high foot traffic. She'd reply, no soul. We need to be part of a real neighborhood. He was, to put it mildly, frustrated. He was used to making decisions in seconds, moving mountains with a single phone call. Brooklyn's process was slow, deliberate, and deeply human. She talked to people. She spent hours in different neighborhoods, just watching, listening, feeling the rhythm of the community. I've found it, she announced, walking into his office a week later. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking completely out of place and yet utterly confident. Found what? The perfect shade of beige for the napkins? He asked, a touch of his old sarcasm returning. The location, she said, ignoring his jibe. She unrolled a map on his desk. It's a derelict warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Carter stared at the map, then at her. Red Hook? Brooklyn? That's an industrial wasteland. There's no foot traffic, no corporate presence. It's financial suicide. It's perfect, she said, her eyes shining with a passion he was beginning to find dangerously captivating. It's a neighborhood with history, with real people. It's a community that's been forgotten. We won't just build a cafe there, we'll build an anchor. A place for people to gather. This is a business, not a charity, he said, his voice hardening. It can be both, she insisted. Come with me, see it for yourself. Before you say no, just see it. He wanted to say no. Every business instinct he had was screaming that this was a terrible idea. But the look in her eyes, the absolute, unshakable belief she had in her vision, it was a force of nature he was powerless to resist. Fine, he sighed, grabbing his coat. Show me your wasteland. The wasteland was even worse than he had imagined. The warehouse was a dilapidated brick shell, its windows boarded up, its facade covered in graffiti. The street was quiet, with a few old storefronts and the distant sound of a ship's horn from the nearby docks. Carter stepped out of his black town car, his polished Italian shoes immediately looking absurd on the cracked pavement. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit. Brooklyn, who had arrived on the subway, was waiting for him, a roll of blueprints under her arm. She took one look at him and burst out laughing. What? He asked, irritated. Rule number 3, remember? She said, grinning. No $1,000 suits on the construction site. This isn't a construction site. It's a ruin. It's a canvas, she corrected, her excitement palpable. She walked over to the rusty metal door and with some effort pulled it open. Welcome to the Sweet Bite. He followed her inside, his nose immediately wrinkling at the smell of dust and decay. The interior was a vast, empty space with broken floorboards, peeling paint, and pigeons nesting in the high rafters. Sunlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing motes of dust. It's a dump, he said flatly. It's magnificent, she breathed, her arms spread wide as if to embrace the space. Look at these beams, she said, running a hand over a massive, rough-hewn wooden support. They're original. We'll restore them, not replace them. And this brick, she touched the exposed wall, it tells a story. Carter just saw dirt and rot. How could anyone see potential in this place? Close your eyes, she said suddenly. What? I'm not playing games, Brooklyn. Just do it, she insisted. Trust me. He let out an exasperated sigh but closed his eyes. The sounds of the city faded, replaced by the echo of their footsteps in the vast, empty space. Okay. Her voice was softer now, a guide in the darkness. Imagine, the front wall is gone, replaced with floor-to-ceiling glass that folds open in the summer, so the cafe spills out onto the sidewalk. The bar is right there. He could hear her pointing, made of reclaimed wood from the old Coney Island boardwalk. The smell of fresh coffee and baking bread fills the air. He could almost smell it. The tables aren't in neat rows. They're scattered, in little nooks with comfy armchairs and low lighting. There are bookshelves everywhere, filled with books from local authors and secondhand shops. People are talking, laughing, working on their laptops. There's a quiet buzz of community. She took his hand, and the unexpected touch sent a jolt through him. She led him a few steps forward. Now, over here, she said, her voice full of passion, is the heart of it, an open kitchen. People can see the bakers kneading dough, the chefs plating food. It's transparent, honest. And up there, she pointed towards the ceiling, the roof is gone, replaced by a greenhouse. That's our rooftop garden. We'll grow our own herbs, our own vegetables. We'll have a rainwater collection system. It'll be a green lung in the middle of this concrete jungle. She finally let go of his hand. Okay, you can open your eyes now. He did. The dump was still a dump. The pigeons were still cooing in the rafters. But something had changed. He wasn't just seeing the ruin anymore. He was seeing her vision. He could almost see the light streaming through the glass walls, hear the murmur of happy customers, smell the coffee. He looked at her. She was standing in a beam of dusty sunlight, her face glowing, her eyes shining with a belief so powerful it was almost tangible. And in that moment, Carter Sterlingworth, a man who dealt in the cold, hard reality of numbers and contracts, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt a flicker of magic. You really see all that, don't you? He asked, his voice a low murmur. I don't just see it, she said, a brilliant smile spreading across her face. I can already taste the coffee. He looked around the decaying space one more time, then back at her. The idea was still insane. The financials were a nightmare, but for the first time, he didn't care. All right, Brooklyn Cooper, he said, a slow, genuine smile forming on his own lips. Let's build your soulless cafe. It's a cafe with a soul, she corrected him, laughing. Right, he said, the smile not leaving his face. That too. And as they stood there amidst the dust and decay, they both knew they weren't just about to build a cafe. They were about to build something much more complicated and infinitely more interesting. The partnership between Carter Sterlingworth and Brooklyn Cooper began less like a collaboration and more like a polite, well-funded Cold War. He was a man accustomed to instant results. She was a woman who believed that good things took time. True to form, Carter's first move was to throw money at the project. He hired Stanton & Finch, the most expensive and sought-after architectural firm in New York. They were known for their sleek, award-winning glass and steel monoliths that looked magnificent on magazine covers but felt sterile to the touch. The first design meeting was held in the Sterlingworth Global Boardroom. Brooklyn arrived in jeans and work boots, carrying a cardboard tube filled with her hand-drawn sketches. The Stanton & Finch team, 3 men in identical black turtlenecks, laid out their pristine digital renderings on the giant screen. Their design was, in a word, perfect and completely wrong. They had gutted the warehouse's historic soul, replacing the original brick with polished concrete and the reclaimed wood beams with sterile steel girders. The cozy nooks she had envisioned were gone, replaced by a minimalist, open-plan space that felt more like an art gallery than a community hub. It's a very clean design, Brooklyn said, choosing her words carefully. Thank you, said the lead architect, a man named Julian who spoke as if every word he uttered was a profound gift to humanity. We've maximized the floor space for optimal customer flow and minimized the material cost by using our standard industrial palette. You've also minimized the soul, Brooklyn countered, her voice quiet but firm. The whole point of the design is to feel warm, to feel like a part of the neighborhood's history. You've turned it into every other soulless coffee shop in Manhattan. Julian gave a condescending smile. Miss Cooper, your original ideas are charming, very aspirational, but they aren't practical for a high-volume commercial space. We're creating a brand, not a living room. Brooklyn looked at Carter, who was sitting at the head of the table, silent, observing. She could see the conflict on his face. This was his world, his language, efficiency, scalability, brand identity. The soul of the building isn't a line item on a budget, Mr. Sterlingworth, she said, directing her words to him. It's the reason people will choose to come to our cafe instead of the Starbucks down the street. It's the reason they'll stay for hours instead of grabbing a coffee to go. You can't put a price on that. Carter looked from Brooklyn's passionate, pleading face to the architect's cool, dismissive ones. His entire business life had been built on the advice of men like Julian. They were the experts, the professionals. Brooklyn was a cleaning lady with a dream on a napkin. Perhaps, Julian said smoothly, sensing Carter's hesitation, we can incorporate some of Miss Cooper's more rustic elements as decorative accents. A reclaimed wood panel here, an exposed brick feature wall there. It's not an accent, Brooklyn snapped, her patience gone. It's the foundation. It's the entire point. She stood up, rolling up her own sketches. Mr. Sterlingworth, you hired me for my vision. If you'd rather have this sterile box, then you don't need me. You just need a checkbook. She turned to leave, her heart pounding. She had just walked away from a multi-million-dollar dream. But she wouldn't let them butcher it. Wait, Carter's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was looking at Julian and his team, his expression unreadable. Gentlemen, Carter said, his voice dangerously calm. Thank you for your time. Your services are no longer required. The architect stared at him, utterly stunned. Julian's jaw literally dropped. I beg your pardon? You're fired, Carter said, the words clear and final. He stood up and walked over to Brooklyn. I made a deal with my partner. I promised to trust her vision. He looked at Brooklyn, a new, profound respect in his eyes. It seems I'd forgotten that. He turned back to the speechless architects. Send me your bill, and please, close the door on your way out. After they had scrambled out of the room in a state of shock, Carter turned to Brooklyn, who was standing by the door, equally stunned. You just fired Stanton & Finch, she said, as if trying to convince herself it was real. I did, he said. He walked over to her and gently took the cardboard tube from her hands. He unrolled her sketches on the table, the hand-drawn lines full of a life and warmth that the digital renderings had completely lacked. "So," he said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, "show me how we build a cafe with a soul." With the architects gone, the project became Brooklyn's entirely. She hired a small, local construction crew from Red Hook, a team of hardworking men and women who knew the neighborhood and respected its history. The warehouse, which had been silent for years, slowly began to come to life with the sounds of hammers, saws, and cheerful shouting. Carter, true to his word, stayed out of the creative decisions, but he couldn't stay away. He found himself drawn to the site, making up excuses to check on the investment. One afternoon, he showed up in his usual attire, a dark Armani suit and shoes that cost more than a week's worth of labor for the entire crew. He stepped out of his car and immediately looked like a penguin in the desert. The air was thick with sawdust, and his polished shoes were instantly covered in a fine layer of white dust. Brooklyn, who was on a ladder inspecting a newly exposed beam, saw him and burst out laughing. "What?" he asked, looking down at his shoes with a frown. "You're going to scare the wood," she called down, grinning. "It's never seen anything so expensive." He walked inside, carefully navigating the cluttered floor. "I came to see the progress." "Progress is being made," she said, climbing down the ladder. "But not in a suit." She grabbed a dusty hard hat from a pile and handed it to him. "Here. Company policy." He took it reluctantly and placed it on his perfectly styled hair. He looked ridiculous, and they both knew it. "Now you look like one of us," she teased. "Almost." "So what's on the agenda for today, boss?" he asked, a hint of his old sarcasm in his voice. Her eyes lit up with a mischievous glint. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. We've been having trouble with this old support post. It needs to come down, but it's stubborn." She pointed to a thick, rotting wooden post in the center of the room. "Think you can handle it?" He looked at the post, then at the sledgehammer leaning against the wall. "How hard can it be?" 5 minutes later, Carter was sweating, his suit jacket was off, his tie was loosened, and he had managed to hit the post exactly 0 times. He had, however, successfully hit the wall next to it twice and his own foot once, though luckily only with the handle. Brooklyn was leaning against a beam, trying and failing to suppress her laughter. "It's deceptively sturdy," he panted, leaning on the sledgehammer. "You're holding it like it's a fragile bird," she said, finally walking over. She took the sledgehammer from him. Her movements were easy, practiced. "You have to use your whole body, not just your arms. Like this." She swung the hammer in a smooth, powerful arc, and it connected with the post with a satisfying crunch. A huge chunk of rotten wood splintered off. He stared at her, impressed. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My dad was a carpenter," she said, her expression softening for a moment. "He taught me that the best way to build something new is to first understand how to take the old things apart with respect." She handed the hammer back to him. "Your turn." He took it, and this time, copying her stance, he swung. The hammer hit the post, not as gracefully as her, but it hit, and in that moment, covered in dust and sweat, his suit probably ruined, Carter felt a strange, exhilarating sense of accomplishment. "Lunchtime," a voice called from the doorway. A food truck had pulled up outside and the crew was lining up. Brooklyn smiled at him. "Come on, investor. Time to refuel." They sat on a pile of lumber, eating tacos out of paper containers, surrounded by the happy chatter of the construction crew. "This is the best meal I've had all month," Carter said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. It was better than any 3 Michelin-star restaurant. "It's because you worked for it," she said, taking a bite of her own taco. They ate in a comfortable silence for a moment, just watching the crew. "Your dad," Carter said suddenly. "You said he was a carpenter." She nodded, her eyes distant. "He was, the best. He could build anything. He always dreamed of opening his own workshop, building custom furniture. But he never got the chance. He got sick." She looked at the warehouse, at the beautiful old beams she was so determined to save. "He always told me, Brooklyn, don't build things, build legacies. Things break. But a legacy, something that helps people, something with a soul that lasts." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That's why this is so important to me. It's not just a cafe, it's my promise to him." Carter looked at her, at the incredible woman who was building so much more than a business. She was building a legacy. And he, Carter Sterlingworth, a man who had only ever built empires of glass and steel, found himself wanting, more than anything, to be a part of it. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, a silent promise passing between them that he understood. And for the first time, he truly did. The demolition of the old support post became a strange sort of baptism for Carter Sterlingworth. He had traded his Armani suit for a pair of work jeans he'd had his assistant buy, which still cost more than Brooklyn's entire wardrobe, and showed up at the site every day. He was still clumsy, still hopelessly out of his element, but he was present. He learned the names of the crew, fetched coffee, and mostly tried to stay out of the way. Brooklyn, in turn, found herself slowly letting her guard down. The arrogant CEO who had laughed at her dream was gone, replaced by this man who listened intently as she explained her designs, who laughed at her bad jokes, and who looked at her with an expression of such raw admiration it sometimes made her forget to breathe. Their dynamic had shifted from a tense partnership to a playful, flirty rivalry. "You know," he said one afternoon, watching her direct a forklift with the precision of a seasoned general, "for a cleaning lady, you're awfully bossy. And for a billionaire," she shot back without missing a beat, "you're surprisingly bad at making coffee. You forgot the sugar again." He grinned, handing her the cup he just brought. "I'm just trying to keep you on your toes." "You're trying to give me a caffeine-induced heart attack," she retorted, but she took the coffee, and her fingers brushed against his for a second longer than necessary. The small spark of electricity was undeniable. The warehouse was transforming. The rotten wood was gone, replaced by sturdy, reclaimed beams. The broken windows were opened up, letting in light and air. Brooklyn's vision was slowly taking shape, and it was even more beautiful than Carter had imagined. He wasn't just funding a project anymore, he was witnessing the birth of something magical, something with a soul. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was falling for the woman who was its heart. The bubble burst on a Tuesday. It came in the form of a man in a crisp city inspector's uniform, holding a clipboard and a bright red piece of paper. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone officially apologetic, but his eyes cold. "I have a stop work order for this site." Brooklyn's smile froze. "A what? On what grounds? We have all our permits." An anonymous complaint was filed regarding potential violations of the Historical Preservation Act, the inspector recited, not looking her in the eye. "This building has been flagged for review as a potential landmark. All construction must cease immediately pending a full investigation by the Commission." "A landmark?" Brooklyn sputtered, looking at the dilapidated brick shell. "This place has been a rotting pigeon coop for 30 years. It's not a landmark, it's an eyesore." "That's for the Commission to decide," the inspector said, taping the red notice to the front door. "If you continue work, you'll face fines of up to $10,000 a day." He left, and the once joyful sounds of construction died down, replaced by a deafening, crushing silence. The crew looked at Brooklyn, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Her dream, which had been so close, was suddenly trapped in a web of bureaucratic red tape. She walked over to the red notice, her hands trembling as she read the official jargon. It felt like a death sentence. When Carter arrived an hour later, he found her sitting on the same pile of lumber where they had shared tacos, her face buried in her hands. "Brooklyn?" he said, his voice soft. He saw the red notice on the door, and a cold, hard fury ignited in his chest. "What is this?" "They're shutting us down," she said, her voice muffled. "Some anonymous complaint. They're saying this place might be a historical landmark." Carter stared at the notice, then back at her devastated form. He knew this wasn't random. In his world, there were no coincidences. An anonymous complaint, a sudden interest from the Historical Preservation Commission. This was a power play. And he had a very good idea who was behind it. He walked over and sat beside her, his usual playful banter gone. "This isn't about the building, Brooklyn. It's about me." She looked up, her eyes red. "What do you mean?" "The head of the Historical Preservation Commission is Arthur Davenport," he said, his voice a low growl. "And his daughter, Victoria Davenport, is my ex-fiancée." Brooklyn stared at him, the pieces clicking into place. "Your ex? She's doing this?" I broke off our engagement a few months before I met you, he explained, his jaw tight. It was a corporate merger more than a marriage. Our families had planned it for years. She did not take it well. She sees this project. She sees you. She's trying to hit me where it hurts. Brooklyn felt a fresh wave of despair. They weren't just fighting City Hall. They were fighting one of the most powerful families in New York. So what do we do? She asked, her voice small. We can't fight them. Carter looked at her, and she saw a flicker of the ruthless CEO she had first met, but this time his fury wasn't directed at her. It was for her. Yes, he said, his voice like ice, we can. He stood up, pulling his phone out. I'm going to call my lawyers. We'll drown them in paperwork. No, Brooklyn said, standing up to face him. No, that's her game. We'd be fighting on her turf. We'll be tied up in legal battles for years. The project will die. So what do you suggest we do? Just give up? He asked, frustrated. No, she said, a new fire in her eyes. We don't fight her with lawyers. We fight her with the truth. We fight her with the community. That night, Carter's gleaming penthouse became their war room. Brooklyn, armed with her laptop and a fierce determination, began to work. Carter, for his part, did something he hadn't done in years. He listened. Victoria's argument is that this building has historical value, Brooklyn said, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. So we need to prove that its real value is not in its past, but in its future. She started typing furiously. We don't need lawyers. We need people. We need the neighborhood to fight for us. For the next 2 days, they worked nonstop. Brooklyn, using her deep understanding of community organizing, launched a grassroots campaign. She created a Save the Sweet Bite website, started a petition, and printed out flyers. Carter, using his resources, amplified her efforts. He had his PR team discreetly push the story to local blogs. He made calls, not to threaten, but to ask for support from other business owners in the area. He watched, completely mesmerized, as Brooklyn transformed. She wasn't just a designer, she was a leader. She organized a community meeting, standing on a makeshift stage in front of the locked-up warehouse, speaking with a passion that was contagious. This isn't just about a cafe. She told the crowd of neighbors who had gathered. This is about us. This is about taking a forgotten piece of our neighborhood and turning it into something that serves all of us. Carter stood at the back of the crowd, watching her. People were cheering, they were signing the petition, they were chanting the name of her cafe. She wasn't just building a business, she was building a movement. Later that night, back in his penthouse, they were both exhausted but energized. The petition has over 5,000 signatures already, she said, her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop. The city councilman for the district just called me, he said, looking at his phone in disbelief. He wants to publicly support our project. They had done it. They had turned Victoria's attack on its head. Brooklyn leaned back on the plush sofa, a tired but triumphant smile on her face. See, sometimes the best business plan has nothing to do with money. He walked over and sat on the coffee table in front of her. You're incredible, you know that? He said, his voice a low murmur. She blushed, looking down at her laptop. I couldn't let her destroy it. She wasn't trying to destroy a building, Brooklyn, he said, his voice serious. She was trying to destroy you, because she saw what I see. And what's that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached out, his hand gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was soft, tentative. Someone who is so full of life, so full of heart, that she makes everything and everyone around her better. They stared at each other, the space between them electric. The city lights twinkled outside, but they only had eyes for each other. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Her own eyes fluttered closed. Their lips were a breath away when his phone sitting on the table buzzed loudly, shattering the moment. He pulled back, a look of pure frustration on his face. He glanced at the screen. It was his lawyer. I have to take this, he said, his voice rough. Yeah, she said, quickly looking back at her laptop, her heart still pounding. Of course. He stood and walked to the other side of the room to answer the call. But the spell was broken. Brooklyn stared at her screen, not seeing the words, her mind replaying that almost kiss. The battle against Victoria wasn't over. And she had a feeling the battle for her own heart had just begun. The morning after the almost kiss was a symphony of exquisite awkwardness. The air in Carter's penthouse, which had become their unofficial headquarters, was thick with unspoken words. Brooklyn was trying to focus on a spreadsheet of local lumber suppliers, but her mind kept drifting to the memory of his hand in her hair, the scent of his cologne, the fractional space between their lips before his phone had shattered the moment. Carter wasn't faring any better. He was pretending to read a financial report, but he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. He kept replaying the scene in his head, cursing his lawyer's timing. He, a man who controlled every aspect of his life with ruthless precision, had been completely undone by a pair of brilliant, defiant brown eyes. "So," Brooklyn said finally, breaking the silence, her gaze fixed on her laptop screen, "the community petition is working. We have a meeting with the City Planning Commission next week." "Good," Carter replied, his voice a little too rough. "That's good news." It was pathetic. They had faced down a billionaire's ex-fiancée, started a community movement, and were about to save a multi-million-dollar project, but they couldn't manage a simple conversation about what had almost happened between them. The reprieve, however, was short-lived. Carter's personal assistant, a perpetually flustered young man named Thomas, rushed in, holding a tablet as if it were a live grenade. "Mr. Sterlingworth, sir, you need to see this," he stammered, his face pale. Carter took the tablet. On the screen was the homepage of a notorious gossip site, City Dirt. The headline was splashed across the page in giant, venomous letters. "From toilets to penthouses, the unbelievable story of Carter Sterlingworth's pop-up girlfriend. Is the billionaire being played by a cunning Cinderella?" The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted Brooklyn as a manipulative opportunist, a cleaning lady with a sob story who had cleverly orchestrated her way into Carter's life and his wallet. It twisted her history of struggle into a narrative of deceit, quoting anonymous sources from Sterlingworth Global, who claimed she was unqualified and had a hypnotic influence over the once pragmatic CEO. The final brutal blow was a photo of her, taken from a distance, looking tired and disheveled outside the warehouse, juxtaposed with a glamorous picture of Carter and Victoria from a year ago. The implication was clear. He had traded class for trash. Brooklyn read the article over his shoulder, and he felt her flinch as if she'd been physically struck. The color drained from her face. They make it sound like I'm some kind of predator," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A cunning Cinderella. They're calling me a gold digger." Carter's hand clenched around the tablet, his knuckles turning white. His protective fury was so potent it was a physical force in the room. This was Victoria's handiwork. He knew it. The language, the cruelty, the way it attacked Brooklyn's dignity. It was all her signature. "Thomas," he said, his voice dangerously low, "get my legal team on the phone. I want to sue this garbage site into oblivion." "No," Brooklyn said, her voice quiet but firm. Carter turned to look at her. She was pale, her eyes filled with hurt, but the trembling had stopped. The fire was back. "That's what she wants," Brooklyn said, her voice gaining strength. "She wants us to react with lawyers and lawsuits. She wants to drag us into a long, ugly, public fight. We'll be stuck in the mud with her, and the project will die. Her story will become the only story." "So what do we do? Just let her get away with this?" he asked, his rage simmering. "No," she said, a steely glint in her eyes. "We don't fight her in the mud. We rise above it. We don't let a gossip rag tell our story. We tell it ourselves." He looked at her, confused. "How?" "She used the media as a weapon," Brooklyn said, a daring, brilliant idea forming in her mind. "So we'll use it as a shield. We don't send a press release. We don't hide. We go on television. Live." Carter stared at her. He was a deeply private man. He loathed the media, loathed the insipid celebrity culture his world often flirted with. The idea of voluntarily sitting for a live television interview was his personal version of hell. "You're serious," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "Deadly serious," she replied. "We go on a credible news program. We tell the truth. We tell everyone how this project started, how I showed you a solution your own architects couldn't see. We tell them about my dream. We don't just deny her story. We make it irrelevant by telling a better one. A true one." He looked at her, at the sheer, audacious courage of her plan. She wasn't running. She was ready to face the fire. and she was asking him to walk into it with her. The old Carter would have refused. He would have used his power to crush the story from the shadows. But the man standing there, the man who had learned how to swing a sledgehammer and eat tacos on a pile of lumber, was different. He thought of her face when she read that article, the raw pain of being so cruelly misjudged. And he knew he would do anything to erase that pain, to show the world the incredible woman he saw. "Okay," he said, a slow, determined smile spreading across his face. "Let's go tell our story." 24 hours later, they were sitting in the green room of the nation's most watched morning news show. The air was thick with the smell of hairspray and nervous energy. Brooklyn was surprisingly calm. Carter, on the other hand, felt like his tie was trying to strangle him. "You're more nervous than I am," she observed, a small, teasing smile on her lips. "I negotiate billion-dollar deals for a living," he retorted. "I don't do talk shows." "Just think of it as the biggest business meeting of your life," she said, gently adjusting his tie. "And the product we're selling is the truth." Her touch was light, but it sent a current through him, steadying his nerves. "5 minutes, Mr. Sterlingworth," her producer called from the doorway. He took a deep breath. "Ready?" he asked her. "Ready," she said, and for the first time he noticed she was squeezing his hand. They walked onto the brightly lit set and sat on the plush sofa across from Eleanor Vance, a journalist famous for her tough but fair interviews. "Mr. Sterlingworth, Miss Cooper, thank you for being here," Eleanor began, her intelligent eyes sizing them up. "A rather unflattering article has been circulating about your partnership. It paints a picture of manipulation. You, Mr. Sterlingworth, as a fool in love, and you, Miss Cooper, as an opportunist. What's your response?" Carter looked directly into the camera, his nervousness gone, replaced by a calm, unwavering authority. "My response, Eleanor, is that the article is correct about one thing," he said. "I am a fool. I was a fool for not recognizing the most talented person in my company when she was right under my nose, cleaning my boardroom toilets." A ripple of surprise went through the studio. "The story they're peddling is that I was played by a cunning Cinderella," Carter continued, his voice dripping with disdain for the words. "The truth is, my company was saved by her. My $2 billion Azure Bay project was dead in the water, stalled by a design flaw my world-class architects couldn't solve." Brooklyn Cooper, in a 2-minute conversation, sketched a solution on a notepad that was so brilliant, so elegant, it left my entire team speechless. He turned to look at Brooklyn, his expression full of a raw, public admiration. "She is not an opportunist. She is a visionary, and if I am guilty of anything, it's of being too arrogant to see the genius standing right in front of me." Eleanor turned to Brooklyn, her skeptical expression softening. "Miss Cooper, the article attacks your background, your qualifications." "My qualifications are that I know what it's like to build something from nothing," Brooklyn said, her voice clear and strong. "I know what it's like to have a dream and to fight for it. The project we're building isn't just another luxury high-rise. It's a community hub, built with sustainable materials, designed to serve the people who live there. That's a qualification you don't learn at Harvard. You learn it by living." She leaned forward, her passion evident. "They attack me because I don't fit into their world, because they can't understand that a person's value isn't determined by their job title or their bank account. A community's health doesn't have a stock price, Eleanor. And that's the bottom line we should be talking about." Her words were powerful, authentic, and utterly compelling. For the next 10 minutes, they didn't just defend themselves. They championed their project, their vision, their belief in a different way of doing business. By the time the interview was over, they had completely rewritten the narrative. As they walked off set, Carter's phone was already exploding with messages. His PR team, his lawyers, even members of the board. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Cafe with a Soul was trending on social media. Back in the penthouse, the adrenaline of their shared victory was still coursing through them. "We did it," Brooklyn said, a huge, relieved smile on her face. "We actually did it." "We did it," he corrected her, his own smile mirroring hers. He walked over to her, his heart pounding. The battle was won. The world outside could wait. "We're a good team," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The best," she whispered back. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, just as he had done before. This time there were no phones, no interruptions. There was only the quiet of the room and the undeniable truth in their eyes. "Brooklyn," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer name or contain. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was everything the almost kiss had promised, and more. It was a kiss of partnership, of shared victory, of a tension that had been building since the day he had laughed at her dream. It was a kiss that tasted of justice and of a promise of a new, incredible beginning. When they finally broke apart, breathless, they just rested their foreheads together, both smiling. "So," she whispered, her eyes still closed, "does this mean I get my own parking space now?" He laughed, a deep, joyful sound that filled the silent penthouse. "Brooklyn Cooper," he said, pulling her close again. "I'll give you the whole damn company." The kiss changed everything. The awkward, unspoken tension that had filled the spaces between them was replaced by a new, intoxicating energy. They were no longer just partners in a rebellious construction project. They were partners in every sense of the word. The aftermath of their television interview was a tidal wave of positive press. The narrative had been completely flipped. Brooklyn was no longer a cunning Cinderella. She was hailed as a grassroots visionary, a symbol of authenticity in a corporate world starved for it. Carter wasn't a fool in love. He was a forward-thinking CEO, brave enough to invest in purpose over profit. Cafe with a Soul was more than a hashtag, it was a movement. Faced with overwhelming public support and pressure from the City Council, the Historical Preservation Commission hastily withdrew its review. The stop work order was lifted. The victory was sweet, and it was theirs. Work at the warehouse resumed with a renewed, joyful energy. Brooklyn was in her element, directing the crew, her face smudged with dirt but lit up with a constant, brilliant smile. And Carter was almost always there, having traded his Armani for jeans and a genuine happiness he hadn't felt in years. Their days were filled with the productive chaos of construction, and their nights were filled with a quiet, breathtaking discovery of each other. They'd sit on the floor of his sterile penthouse, surrounded by her hand-drawn blueprints, sharing takeout from a cheap Thai place and talking for hours. He learned about her childhood, about the father who taught her to build, about the fierce love she had for a community that had always been hers. She learned about his, a lonely boy raised in boardrooms, taught that emotions were liabilities and that the Sterlingworth name was a crown he was born to wear and to suffer for. "You know," she said one night, tracing the lines of a blueprint with her finger, "for a guy who used to laugh at ideas on a napkin, you're not so bad." He smiled, reaching out and gently taking her hand. "I was an idiot." "You were," she agreed, a playful glint in her eye, "but you're a teachable idiot." He laughed, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest one I can give right now," she said, her smile softening. In that small, perfect bubble of theirs, it felt like nothing could go wrong. But they had forgotten that Carter's world, the one he was so desperately trying to escape, had not forgotten about him. The call came on a Thursday morning. It wasn't from a journalist or a board member. It was from a number that made Carter's blood run cold. The private line to his father's office. "Mr. Sterlingworth will see you this afternoon. 4 o'clock. Do not be late." The voice of his father's assistant was as cold and sharp as ever. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. Carter hung up the phone, and Brooklyn, who was sitting across from him at his desk, saw the warmth instantly drain from his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," he said, his voice a low, tight murmur. "My father." Arthur Sterlingworth's office was on the 90th floor of the original Sterlingworth Tower, a place that made Carter's own penthouse look like a cheerful playground. The room was a cathedral of dark wood, black marble, and silence. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets. The only decoration was a massive, imposing portrait of Carter's grandfather, the founder of the empire, his cold eyes seeming to judge everyone who entered. Arthur was standing by the window, his back to the door, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He didn't turn when Carter walked in. "You've become an embarrassment," Arthur said, his voice calm but laced with a venom that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Father," Carter began, his own voice sounding foreign and small in the cavernous room. I saw the television interview, Arthur continued, still not turning. I read the articles. A cafe with a soul. Is that what we are now, Carter? Purveyors of sentimentality? He finally turned, and his eyes, a colder, harder version of Carter's own, were filled with a profound disappointment. I sent you to Harvard. I gave you control of a global corporation. I taught you that our name, the Sterlingworth name, means power, dominance, victory, and you're squandering it on some social experiment with a cleaning lady. Her name is Brooklyn, Carter said, his voice firming, a spark of his own fire igniting. And it's not a social experiment. It's the most promising and innovative project I've been a part of in years. Arthur let out a short, dismissive laugh. Innovative? A coffee shop in a slum? We build skyscrapers that scrape the heavens, Carter, not shacks that serve muffins to the unwashed masses. It's more than a coffee shop. It's a new model for business, one that proves you can be profitable and have a purpose. Purpose? Arthur scoffed, walking slowly towards his massive desk. Our purpose is to win, at any cost. A lesson you seem to have forgotten thanks to the influence of this nobody. He sat down, his posture that of a king on his throne. I did some digging on your Miss Cooper. A college dropout with a dead carpenter for a father. She is nothing. She comes from nothing, and she will drag you and our name down to nothing with her. You will not talk about her that way, Carter said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I will talk about her any way I please, his father retorted. Because this is not just about her. It's about you. Your judgment has been compromised. You fired Stanton and Finch, one of the most respected firms in the world, on the whim of a janitor. You've turned our company into a laughingstock, a soap opera for the tabloids. You are weak, Carter, and a Sterlingworth is never weak. The word hung in the air between them, the ultimate insult, the one Arthur had used to shape and control his son his entire life. This stops now, Arthur said, his voice dropping, becoming even colder. You will scrap this ridiculous pet project. You will issue a public statement announcing that your association with Miss Cooper has ended. You will come back to this office, to your responsibilities, and you will start acting like the man you were raised to be. Carter stared at his father, a cold, sickening realization dawning on him. Nothing had changed. He could be a billionaire, a CEO, a titan of industry, but in this room, he would always be that small, disappointing boy who could never quite measure up. And if I don't? Carter asked, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a look of cold finality on his face. Then you are no longer my son, he said, the words as final as a death sentence. You will be removed as CEO of Sterlingworth Global. You will be cut out of the family trust. You will walk out of this building with nothing but the clothes on your back and your cleaning lady. The Sterlingworth name, the legacy, the empire, it will all be gone. So you must choose, Carter. What is more important to you? Everything we have built, or this little fantasy you've constructed with a girl from the gutter? Carter didn't remember the drive back to his penthouse. His mind was a maelstrom of anger, of pain, of a lifetime of suppressed resentment. He had fought Victoria, the media, the city commission. But this was different. This was his father. The man whose approval he had craved his entire life, even as he hated him for it. He found Brooklyn in the living room, surrounded by fabric samples and paint swatches, her face glowing with excitement as she planned the interior of her cafe. She looked up when he walked in, and her smile immediately vanished when she saw the look on his face. Carter, what happened? You look broken. He sank onto the sofa, the fight completely drained out of him. He looked at her, at this incredible woman who had brought so much light into his dark, orderly world. And he knew his father was forcing him to choose between the sun and the shadows. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in his life, he let the mask of the perfect, powerful CEO fall away completely. He gave me an ultimatum, Carter said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. My father. He told me to choose. Brooklyn sat on the floor in front of him, her expression a mixture of fear and a fierce, protective strength. Choose what? You and the cafe, he said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. Or everything else, my job, my inheritance, my name, everything. She stared at him, her heart breaking for him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the agony of a choice that was no choice at all. This was her fault. She had brought this chaos into his life. Then you have to go back, she said, her voice a near whisper, though the words felt like a betrayal to her own heart. Carter, you can't lose your entire world for me, for a cafe. He looked at her, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. That's the thing, Brooklyn, he said, his voice quiet but clear. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Until I met you, I didn't have a world. I had an empire. You're the world. She leaned into his touch, tears welling in her eyes. But what are we going to do? He looked around his vast, empty penthouse, at the cold marble and the impersonal art. Then he looked back at her, at the warmth and the life that radiated from her. I don't know, he said, his voice full of a terrifying, liberating uncertainty. But for the first time in my life, I think we get to build it ourselves. He looked at the blueprints for her cafe spread across the floor. And I think we start here. The ultimatum from Arthur Sterlingworth didn't just crack Carter's world. It shattered it. But in the wreckage, something new and unexpectedly strong began to form. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, liberating clarity. He had been playing his father's game his entire life, and he had just realized he didn't have to play anymore. So what do we do? Brooklyn asked that night, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. They were sitting on the floor of his penthouse, surrounded by her blueprints, the plans for her small cafe suddenly looking like a declaration of war against an empire. We fight, he said, but the word felt different in his mouth. It wasn't the aggressive, hostile takeover kind of fight he was used to. It was something else. But we do it my way. She looked at him, a small, knowing smile on her face. You mean our way? He looked at her, at the unwavering strength in her eyes, and a genuine, unburdened smile spread across his face. Yes, he said, our way. The official notice arrived the next morning, delivered by a cold, efficient courier. An emergency meeting of the Sterlingworth Global Board had been called for the following day. The agenda was a single, brutal line item, a vote on the removal of Carter Sterlingworth as Chief Executive Officer. He's not wasting any time, Carter said, his voice a low growl as he read the notice. Good, Brooklyn replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. Neither are we. For the next 24 hours, the penthouse became a different kind of war room. The old Carter would have surrounded himself with lawyers, plotting hostile countermoves, preparing financial attacks. The new Carter had only one strategist. Brooklyn. Okay, what's the plan? She asked, pulling up a chair, all business. How do we convince a board of directors loyal to your father to vote against him? We don't, Carter said, surprising her. I'm not going in there to save my job. She looked at him, confused. Then what are you going to do? I'm going to give them the same choice my father gave me, he said, a new, dangerous light in his eyes. They can choose the past or they can choose the future. They can choose the empire or they can choose the soul. Brooklyn's eyes widened as she understood. He wasn't going to defend himself. He was going on the attack. Okay, she said, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. Okay, I like it. But you can't go in there talking like a CEO. They're expecting numbers, projections, a defense of your actions. If you give them that, you're playing their game. So what do I do? He asked, genuinely seeking her guidance. You talk like a human being, she said, her passion igniting. You tell them a story, our story. You don't tell them how the sweet bite will be profitable. You tell them why it will be meaningful. You don't talk about market share. You talk about community. You don't defend me. You celebrate me. He watched her, completely captivated. She was more than his partner. She was his conscience, his inspiration. They're going to call you weak, emotional, she warned. My father already has, he said with a humorless laugh. There's nothing left to lose. Wrong, she said, reaching out and taking his hand. You have everything to gain. The next afternoon, they walked into the Sterlingworth Global headquarters together. The atmosphere in the lobby was thick with whispers and stares. The news of the emergency meeting had leaked, and the entire company was watching. Carter, who would normally have strode through the lobby with an air of untouchable power, now walked with a quiet, calm dignity. And Brooklyn was right by his side, not behind him, her presence a silent, powerful statement. They rode the private elevator up to the 90th floor in silence, their hands clasped together. Nervous? She asked as the doors opened. Terrified, he admitted with a smile. But for the first time, I feel like I'm walking into a fight that's worth having. The boardroom was a tomb. The long, black marble table was surrounded by the stern, grim-faced members of the board, men who had served his grandfather, men whose loyalty was to the name Sterlingworth, not to the man who currently held the title. At the head of the table sat Arthur, looking as if he were carved from ice, his expression a mask of cold, triumphant authority. He didn't acknowledge Brooklyn's presence. To him, she was invisible. "Let's begin," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "We are here to discuss a grave matter. The erratic and emotionally compromised behavior of my son, the current CEO of this company." For the next 20 minutes, Arthur laid out his case with brutal, surgical precision. He spoke of Carter's inexplicable decision to fire a top-tier architectural firm. He mentioned the frivolous cafe project, painting it as a reckless waste of company resources. He detailed Carter's inappropriate relationship with a low-level employee, framing it as a catastrophic lapse in judgment that had made the company a public spectacle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every word was a carefully chosen indictment, designed to paint his son as a weak, foolish leader who was a danger to the empire. This company was built on strength, on logic, on the relentless pursuit of power, Arthur concluded, his cold gaze sweeping across the board. My son has forgotten these principles. He has allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. He is no longer fit to lead. I ask this board to do its duty and remove him for the good of the Sterlingworth legacy. He sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a flawless execution. Every member of the board looked at Carter with expressions ranging from pity to stern disapproval. The vote was a foregone conclusion. Then Carter stood up. He didn't look at the files in front of him. He didn't look at the board members. He looked directly at his father. "You're right," he said, his voice surprisingly calm and clear. The board members shifted in their seats, surprised. "You're right about everything." Arthur's lips curved into a faint, triumphant smile. "I have been emotional," Carter continued, his voice gaining strength. "I have been making decisions based on sentiment, not just spreadsheets, and you are absolutely right that I have forgotten the principles upon which you built this company." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, before delivering the final, devastating blow. "And thank God for that." Arthur's smile vanished. The board stared, stunned. "For 50 years, Carter said, his voice now ringing with a power they had never heard from him before, a power that came from conviction, not from his last name. "This company has been brilliant, and it has been hollow. We've built a legacy of profit, but we've lost our soul along the way. We've become a monument to wealth, a beautiful, silent, empty house." He finally turned to the board. "My father is asking you to choose between two paths. His path, the one of ruthless, soulless profit, and my path." He smiled, a genuine, fearless smile. "And he is right. I am no longer fit to lead you down his path, because I have found a better one." He looked across the room, his eyes finding Brooklyn. She was watching him, her face filled with so much love and pride it took his breath away. A few weeks ago, this company was about to lose a $2 billion deal because of a design flaw our best and brightest couldn't solve. We were stuck, and the person who saved us wasn't a high-paid consultant or a world-renowned architect. It was a cleaning lady. He pointed directly at Brooklyn. That woman, Brooklyn Cooper, who my father so easily dismisses as a nobody, had more vision, more brilliance, and more integrity in a sketch on a napkin than this entire boardroom has shown in a year. She didn't just solve an engineering problem. She reminded me of what we are supposed to be building. Not just structures, but legacies. Not just businesses, but communities. He turned back to the board, his voice full of a passion that was electrifying. "So yes, I am investing in her ridiculous project. And I am not just funding it, I am making it the new model for the future of this company. We are going to build more cafes with souls. We are going to invest in more projects that have a purpose beyond the bottom line. Because the world is changing, gentlemen. And if we don't find our soul, this empire my father is so desperate to protect will be nothing more than a beautiful, irrelevant fossil." He stood tall, no longer a son seeking approval, but a leader declaring his vision. "So you do have a choice to make today," he said, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. You can vote to remove me. You can choose to remain in the past, a company of beautiful empty houses, or you can vote for the future. You can vote for a company with a soul. He looked at his father one last time. No anger, no fear, just a quiet, profound finality. I have already made my choice. He sat down. The boardroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Every eye was on him, then on Arthur, then on Brooklyn. The vote was about to be called. The fate of the Sterlingworth Empire and of their love hung in the balance. The silence that followed Carter's speech was not just an absence of noise, it was a physical presence. It was the sound of an empire holding its breath. The 12 board members, men who had built their lives on the cold, hard logic of profit and loss, looked as if they had just witnessed a tectonic shift in their universe. They stared at Carter, then at his father, then at Brooklyn, who sat watching Carter with an expression of such profound love and pride that it was a force in itself. Arthur Sterlingworth's face was a mask of cold fury. His son had not just defied him, he had publicly dismantled the very philosophy that had built their dynasty. The board will now vote, Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous command, attempting to regain control. All in favor of the motion to remove Carter Sterlingworth as CEO, signify by raising your hand. He raised his own hand, a single defiant pillar of the old world. He expected the others to follow, as they always had. But no other hands went up. One by one, the board members looked at Arthur, then at Carter, and then slowly one of them began to applaud. It was a soft, hesitant sound at first, but it was a start. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the cold, silent boardroom was filled with a thunderous, defiant ovation. They weren't just applauding a speech, they were voting. They were choosing the future over the past. They were choosing the man with a soul over the man with an empire. Arthur Sterlingworth stared at the scene, his face a mask of disbelief. He had lost. In his own boardroom, in front of the men he controlled, he had been utterly and completely defeated. He slowly lowered his hand, the gesture a symbol of his crumbling power. He stood up, his posture rigid, and looked at his son one last time. There was no concession in his eyes, only a cold, bottomless rage. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing the end of an era. The applause died down, and a new, energized silence filled the room. The lead board member, a man named Harrison who had served the company for 40 years, stood up. "Mr. Sterlingworth," he said, looking at Carter with a new, profound respect. "The board rejects the motion. You have our full confidence. Now, tell us more about this café with a soul." Carter looked around the room, at the faces of the men who were now looking at him not as a disappointing son, but as a leader. He had won. But as he looked at them, he realized something profound. This wasn't his victory to celebrate. Not here. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and steady. "But if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with my lead partner." He walked across the room, past the stunned board members, directly to Brooklyn. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She took it, and together, they walked out of the boardroom, leaving the empire and its politics behind. They didn't go back to the penthouse. They didn't go to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. They got in his car, and he drove, their hands still clasped together, all the way to Red Hook, Brooklyn. They walked into the warehouse, their warehouse, the place where it had all truly begun. The construction was half finished, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and fresh paint. It was a beautiful, chaotic, perfect mess. It was their future. "So," she said, her voice a soft murmur in the vast, quiet space, "you won." "No," he said, turning to face her, his hand still holding hers. He looked around the space, at the restored beams, the exposed brick walls, the empty space where the rooftop garden would be. This is the win." He looked back at her, his eyes full of an emotion so deep, so raw, it made her heart ache. "My whole life, Brooklyn," he began, his voice rough, "I've been building things. Skyscrapers, portfolios, an empire, but they were all just structures. Empty houses. You taught me how to build a home." She smiled through the tears that were starting to form in her eyes. "It's a pretty messy home right now." "It's the most beautiful home I've ever seen," he said. He let go of one of her hands and reached into his pocket, his own hand trembling slightly. He pulled out a small, simple object, not a ring, but a single, old, rusty iron key. "I found this when we were clearing out the rubble," he said, holding it up. It was the original key to this warehouse. It's old, it's bent, it's not worth anything. He looked into her eyes, his own shining with tears. But to me, it's the most valuable thing in the world, because it opened the door to you. He got down on one knee, right there on the dusty concrete floor, amidst the sawdust and the dreams. "I don't want to be a Sterlingworth anymore, Brooklyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to be yours. I don't want to run an empire. I want to build a life with you." He held out the old rusty key. "Brooklyn Cooper, you brilliant, impossible, incredible woman, you are my soul. Will you marry me?" She was openly sobbing now, tears of pure, unadulterated joy streaming down her face. She didn't even look at the key. She just looked at him, the man who had been willing to lose everything to find his own heart. "Yes," she whispered, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, you teachable idiot. Of course, yes." He stood up and slid the old key onto her finger like it was the most precious diamond in the world, and then he kissed her. A deep, profound kiss that was a promise of a lifetime of legacies, of purpose, of a home filled, finally, with a soul. 1 year later, the bell above the door of the Sweet Bite jingled, and a wave of warm air, smelling of fresh-baked bread, roasted coffee, and cinnamon, spilled out onto the bustling Red Hook sidewalk. The cafe was a resounding success, a beloved heart of the community, always packed with a chaotic, joyful mix of artists, families, and old-timers from the neighborhood. Behind the reclaimed wood counter, Brooklyn, her face glowing, handed a coffee to a customer, her laughter echoing in the space. Her dream was no longer a sketch on a napkin. It was a living, breathing, beautiful reality. At a small table in the corner, a man in simple jeans and a sweater was bouncing a 6-month-old baby boy on his knee. A baby with his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's brilliant smile. "And this, Arthur," Carter Sterlingworth whispered to his son, "is what a real legacy looks like." He looked up, his eyes meeting Brooklyn's across the crowded room. She smiled at him, a smile that held all the promises of a lifetime. He had given up an empire, but he had gained a world with a soul. And in the happy, noisy chaos of their little cafe, in the heart of the woman who had taught him how to build it, Carter Sterlingworth was finally, truly home. What did you think of the story of Carter and Brooklyn? On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey from a boardroom laugh to a cafe with a soul? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And for everyone who has stayed with us until the very end, who believes that the best business plan is one written with the heart, please comment legacy. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more narratives that will change the world.